It's my very great pleasure to welcome you to a special history forum. I think this is one of our first joint efforts between the Faculty of Culture and the Department of History and Philosophy. So welcome. This session has been in the works and being planned for quite a long time. So we're very, very pleased to be able to bring you this session at this stage in the semester. Everything is winding down, but I think we can certainly look forward to a little bit of a break from the norm and explorations in Caribbean calligraphy. We wanted to open up this session mostly to academics, to people in the public, people who have a love for history, for art, for writing, but also for teachers, because we think, I know that Paul has a great passion for sharing his love for calligraphy, but also to develop those fine motor skills that I think so many of our youngsters are now missing out on because they're constantly on their tablets and typing, and even we are losing those skills as well. And I think what I really love about Paul's work is that he really wants to ensure that people understand that the Caribbean has been kind of entrenched in the development of calligraphy and the Caribbean hand. And he's really trying to foster our greater understanding of that foray. So I'm really, really pleased that he's going to bring us through that today. And just by way of introduction, if you don't know already, Paul Antonio is a Trinidadian by birth, where he developed a passion for the writing on old maps and botanical and wildlife illustration. That his passion was, and it was in this space that his passion for Western calligraphy blossomed. Paul left and went on to study letterform history at the Department of Typography and Graphic Communication at the University of Reading in 1998, and was awarded one of 10 art and craft scholarships from the Commonwealth Foundation. He went on to the Reigate School of Art and Design to study calligraphy, gilding, and heraldic painting, specializing in historical materials and techniques. And then he went on to studying Arabic calligraphy, English paleography, and archaeological illustration at Birkbeck University. He's also worked in Egypt as an assistant archaeological illustrator and for the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. And this role assisted him in illustrating some of the hieroglyph collection at the Petrie Museum of Egyptian Archaeology in London. Paul's love for paleography is the key to his studies in the various historical scripts he teaches, and he has an innovative methodology by distilling the basics from a geometric perspective to act as a framework for the learning of an historical script. He is the author of Copperplate Script, a yin and yang approach, which is an innovative simplification to the learning of copperplate script. So I'm very pleased to learn more, and I'm eager to learn more. So we do have a few house rules, just so that you're aware. Paul will be taking us through some demonstrations. So what he's asked, if you have questions, please type them in the chat. And then between the both of us, we will try to manage your questions as he's going through. We'll have a general question session at the end. So what you can do is, as he's demonstrating, you can ask your questions, but do keep in mind that we also will have a question and answer session at the end. And I don't know if you want me to mention anything more, if I've left out anything, Paul.
No.
All
so
right.
For those, if you do want to put a question into the chat, I find it very helpful to do a little line of question marks, so that whilst I'm going through the chat, I can spot those questions really quickly. and get to them as I'm answering. I will answer the questions at the end of the demonstration and the discussion, and then we can have you guys come up and ask questions directly if you want to.
Great. Well, when you're ready, Paul.
Okay. Excellent. So, hello everyone. Thank you all for joining me here today. Thank you, Tara and Alison, and everyone who has worked so hard to get this, to pull this together. Obviously, we've been working on this for quite some time, and we've tried it in a few different iterations, but this seemed to be the best way to start off this interactive session, because I also do not live in the West Indies currently, so it was a little bit tricky to manage this, and we opted to do it via Zoom first to garner interest and to connect people who are interested in writing, be it academically, historically, practically, artistically, so that we can then build on that and hopefully generate a larger interaction later on. So I've spent some time sort of looking at the development and use of letter forms in the West Indies for quite some time. My first sort of foray into this happened accidentally when I was visiting the National Archives in Trinidad when I was 17. And I started looking at slavery documents, and I was amazed by the handwriting. Now, the thing that you have to sort of weigh up is what exactly are we going to be talking about? Because when people talk about calligraphy, they talk about calligraphy basically means beautiful writing, kalli and graphos from the Greek. But historical writing is actually handwriting. It's the handwriting of that period. It's only really in the 1900s that we start using the word calligraphy to describe beautiful writing. But for all intents and purposes, handwriting from these historical periods is exactly what that word states. It's handwriting. It's more beautiful than what we do today, hence we call it beautiful writing. So in looking at these slavery ledgers, when I was 17, I noticed that there was this really beautiful script. And I had already, that was already, I had already been practicing calligraphy for a sort of 9-year period. And I loved the accuracy of these forms. Later on, when I went to Reigate in the United Kingdom, and I started studying formal calligraphy, one of the scripts I focused on was a script called copperplate script. Now, copperplate script evolved out of another script called English roundhand, and it is English roundhand which was taken to the English colonies. And that was the basis of the handwriting. Now, there are lots of things that Tara and Anne and Alison and myself have discussed about how were people taught? Who was teaching these people to write this script? In the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, the English writing masters produced beautiful copybooks for people to practice and learn from, but they also taught them in physical one-to-one classes and physical instructions. So we don't really have any information on this. We don't really know how this was taught. We know that there are incidences of schools where handwriting would obviously have been taught, but what the system was and how it was disseminated is something that requires a considerable amount of research. And Bancroft and I, when Anne moved back to Barbados, we started having conversations about whether or not there was vellum and parchment in the West Indies. Of course, these are really problematic materials in humid and seasonally humid climates because they buckle in humid climates, they absorb moisture, and they are practically impossible to work with. But of course, you had lots of cattle, and lots of tanneries. So from there, we started to see that there was the possibility of having parchment works in the West Indies where we don't know. So this is a really new field. It's a new area of exploration, because I think for a long time, historians have really been looking at the content of the writing rather than the materiality and the material culture behind it. So I'm hoping that this will start some of you inquiring about the materials which would have been used historically. So what I'm going to do in this lecture demonstration is I decided to set this up in such a way that I will demonstrate the basis of this script, this English roundhand script. I'll demonstrate the copperplate script and how it varies from English roundhand, just to give you a sense of the structure of the script. My reasoning for this is, for those of you studying history or those of you doing research in original source material and struggling with transcription, I feel that seeing the writing of the alphabet would help you a little bit more. And for those of you who are interested in calligraphy as an artistic pursuit, seeing this written will also help to inspire you to want to learn the script. And of course, encourage a little bit of overlap between academics and practitioners. So I'm also going to show you some other scripts that would have been written and how they might have influenced the development of calligraphic writing in the West Indies. I will also introduce a quill, so you can see the differences between quill writing and pointed nib writing. Now, I make a distinction between English roundhand and copperplate script at around 1850. The reason for this is around 1650, 1700, we really start to see English writing masters using copperplate engravings to reproduce their work into copybooks. The tools used up until 1850 would have been quills, be them crow quills for really fine writing at 1 or 2 millimeters, and really clean, sharp lines, as well as goose feathers. Now, when I was at Reigate, we were taught that the principal quill that was used would have been a goose quill. And of course, recently, I've been sent some information, which I will share with you a little bit later on, talking about quills. And it states that swan quills were also on shipping manifests. Now, we have used swan quills. I have used swan quills to write with, but they are very different to goose quills. And I think that discussion is really something that we can have once we sort of have the question and answer session. But I do want to introduce you to quills and why the writing of quills, writing with quills is so problematic. So we used quills up until about 1850, and then around sort of 1815, we start to see the development of pointed flexible metal nibs. And it's really around 1850 that these metal nibs become a huge part of the manufacturing process. There are huge factories which opened up in England and in Germany and in other places in Europe. And they started making these metal nibs, and people started using them. So around 1850, you find that quills were very rarely used, as these metal nibs became easier to use simply because you didn't have to keep cutting them. You could just get a new one. And the shape of the metal nibs then affected the structure of the letters. And this is why I make this distinction between English roundhand prior to 1850 and copperplate script after 1850, because the script starts to resemble what the engraver's burin did on a sheet of copper. So I know that sounds a little bit technical, but I'll go through it in a little bit more detail, making some demonstrations. So I'm going to write copperplate script for you so that you can see how the script looks. And those of you doing research in these original documents, I'm sure you'll recognize some of these forms. This is the classic treatment of the script. It's very clear, it's very simplistic, it's very easy to read. Some of you will also recognize some of these letters as part of your own writing system. So I'm using a Gillot 303 nib, and and I have a 55-degree grid behind my writing. And you'll notice that I sometimes move the camera around because as I'm writing, I change position. So when I move to the broad edge scripts, you will see that as well. So the reason I wanted to do that was to show you the cadence of the writing. Now, when I write copperplate script, or when I teach copperplate script, or when my students are practicing copperplate script, we are learning this script as an artistic pursuit. And yes, of course, many of us use it for work. We address envelopes, we do scrolls, we do tons of things. But what we're not doing is we're not using it for everyday handwriting. And we're certainly not using it in the way that the planters or clerks would have used it in the 18th, 19th centuries in the West Indies. So this got me to thinking, how different is the script, or rather, how different are the scripts in the West Indies, which evolved out of English roundhand? And I never really anticipated that there would be so much of a difference, because in England, when English roundhand was taught, the general public, or those learning the script, tended to stick to the convention of the script. There was not a lot of, they didn't depart that much from the construct, from the framework that I've just shown you. The West Indies is very different. So I started looking at documents at Kew Palace. I went to the museum in Barbados, and I was very fortunate to have access to the documents there. I've been to the archives in Trinidad. I've seen documents from Jamaica and from St. Kitts and Grenada. And they are very different to the documents written in England. So there is something that happened to the script when it was written in the West Indies. Now, there are lots of other circumstances to consider. Things like humidity, what paper they were working with, what inks they were writing with, what quills they were writing with, and of course, later on, what metal nibs got to the West Indies. And of course, you put metal nibs in a container and you put them on a ship and you send them across the sea, and they'll rust. So when they arrive in the West Indies, what is the condition of the nib? Is it usable? Does that then affect the kind of script that would come out of it? Obviously, I've seen with my own nibs, when they rust, I can't produce these beautiful, delicate hairlines. So the script changes. It's a little bit more coarse. It might be that the rusting affects the flexibility. So you end up with more of a monoline script. And this is one of the versions of the script, which really becomes quite apparent when you start looking at documents written, ledgers written by clerks or planters, or whosoever may have been doing the writing. So I wanted you to see what this cadence is like. And for those of you doing this original research, this should help you understand a little bit more about the shapes of the letters. And at the end, I put on the long S, which is a shape that many people tend to be confused by. So that's the long S there. And you'll usually find that in the middle of a word, but never at the end. So it can also be written like this. It's essentially an F, but the F has a crossbar, and the long S doesn't. So there are lots of ways that it can be written. And I think it's the variety of letters that people are generally not accustomed to that can cause these problems. For instance, you have these two R's. We have this R and this R. And then you have the half R, which is this or that. So once you start to recognize the the variant letters, you find that the reading of the script becomes a little bit easier. One of the things that I've done in the majuscules is I've done this more decorative balancing serif, and I've done this, which is more typical of what you will see in utilitarian writing documents. You very rarely see this kind of thing, but you will definitely see these swell stroke shapes. I've also put the two S's in. There is a third majuscule, so I won't expect you to remember them, so I will do them together. You can have this S and this S. But you can also have this S as a majuscule. You can quite easily have it as a minuscule as well. And then you can also have the traditional form of the S, like so. Some points of confusion may be you might be seeing a ligature, and that could confuse things if it's written really quickly or if the ink bleeds. Then there are instances of the X. And sometimes you see variant letters like the D, which comes over itself. Other letters you might find varying. Generally, things like the K will vary. The W varies because we see this W. And historically, the W was this. So by learning to recognize these simple variants of the letters, you'll find that it becomes a little bit easier to transliterate and translate these letters and original documentation where you're struggling. I've also put in this ampersand, which is typical of an 18th century ampersand, but you also have this ampersand and this, because using an uncial script, that's the ampersand that you would expect to see with uncial. I'll just do it with a broad edge nib as well, so you can see what it really looks like in its historical form. So there is the uncial and the half uncial form from the 4th century. So for those of you struggling with translating these documents, and I know a lot of history students, when they're looking at original material, they see some of these variants, and you're so unaccustomed to the variants. I mean, the first problem is you're so unaccustomed to writing. And then this is an entirely different alphabet. So when you encounter variants, they are even more different to what you're accustomed to seeing in your normal handwriting, that it can be a little bit confusing. by spending a little bit of time learning the script, learning the calligraphic construct of the script, you'll find that these letters become a little bit easier to read. Of course, you do have other problems with things like suspensions and contractions and abbreviations, which is a whole other thing that I'm not really going to go into here. Now, in some of the documents I've seen, which are influenced by the French, you have another script which is called the Ronde. And the Ronde is a rounder script. It's not normally found in the British West Indies, but because of things like the sedular population and the proximity to the French West Indian Islands, you do find instances of these letters creeping into the vernacular hands of the British West Indies. So I'm going to show you some basic writing of the Ronde. I'll write out some of the minuscule and then I'll do some of the majuscules so you get a sense of how they work, and then I'll do some blending or bastardizations of the scripts. So I have my camera tilted quite a lot. If I zoom out, you'll see the edge of the desk is here. So for the Ronde, I need to work slightly differently. I need to be about here because it's at a different angle. And of course, that also tells you that if I'm changing the angle of my page, what was happening on the docks? What were the writing desks like? How tall were they? I'm sitting, but I'm sitting quite tall. And did they turn the pages? How big were these ledgers? Were they able to move them, or did they have to move around them themselves to do this writing? So the Ronde is written with a broad edge, as copperplate script I just used works with a pointed nib. So with the pointed nib, if you apply no pressure, you get a thin line. And if you apply pressure, the tines spread and you get a thick line. You just get rid of the ink so you can see what's happening there. So you see the tines spreading. Whereas with a broad edge nib, in order to get a thin line, it's all about the angle. So just going to get some ink on there. To get a thin line, I would go across, and to get a thick line, I would go down. So to get a thin line up, I would have to turn from a horizontal pitch to an angle and glide along the edge and come down. So this is the basis of broad edge nib work. So the Ronde is a really beautiful French script from the 18th century. And it looks like this. So you can see where that D comes from. And immediately you start to see some other variants. So we also have the long S in here, which looks like this. And obviously you can see why it's very easy to confuse this with that. I'm not really going to look at the majuscules, but I also want to look at another script, which is an italic script, which is based on cancelleresca cursiva. Because of course in England, you had Bastard Secretary, which is really rare to see in the West Indies. And later on, when Elizabeth I started to learn English italic script, then it was developed in England, in the English court. That script started to be used by part of the English population because it was used in the court. It was used by the court rather than in the courts. And it looked similar to this, so I have an upright version of this. And of course, you also have the spectacle, the G, which would have been used as well. The scripts don't live in isolation of each other. So one of the biggest problems that which happened with handwriting in England was part of the country chose to stick with copperplate script, and the other part chose to stick with italic. And there was no divide. It was just some people chose one and some people chose the other. So in a town, you could have an elementary school which taught its basic copperplate script in its monoline form, ball and stick, which many of us would have learned in the West Indies. And you would have learned this ball and stick method, which looks very much like this. Yeah. And that eventually became this. But you might have learned this at primary school. And then when you went to secondary school, they were teaching this. So this caused a lot of problems with handwriting in England. And of course, handwriting fell apart very quickly in England, and the kids were very excited to not have to write, simply because of having started with one script and then being forced to learn another one. So I'm telling you this because in the West Indies, the same thing would not have happened at such an extent, because it was primarily English roundhand that we were using in the West Indies during the slavery period. But you would have had instances of other letters creeping into the vernacular simply because of their existence historically in a family. So if it was a French family who had moved to an English-speaking country, you'll find that some of those French letters would have crept into the writing system on that plantation. So that can be quite a fascinating study, trying to pick out these French letters to help you discern whether or not a family was of French extraction, because of the incidence of French letters in their documentations. So that's basically how the scripts would have worked in the West Indies. Now, I'm using really beautiful ink on really lovely paper with really, really amazing nibs. It would have been a very different experience in the writing, because, of course, you would have been using a quill. And the quills work in a very different way. And the way in which English roundhand would have been written is very different with a quill. So I'm going to run through some images that I have, and I will point out some things to you, which I will come back to, so that you can see, you can start to compare and understand some of the shapes of the letters and discern what might be quill work and what might be pointed nib work, pointed flexible metal nib work. So this is a really great clipping from 1783. And I'm sorry, my cursor is stuck.
I think what's so interesting as we're waiting, I don't know if many of you are picking up on it, but I'm practicing my own handwriting as I'm watching, and noting all of the subtle differences and changes that have occurred over time. For many of you, you might be deciphering older scripts, and I found that fascinating, as well as trying to see and remember where I've used and viewed things like the ampersand and how that has changed in different forms, and maybe how I might have been reading things wrong in the past as well. But I hope you get a real appreciation for the artistry of writing, and how we have and we're losing some of these creative forms, but also our young people are not really practicing those fine motor skills on the level that, you know, was once demanded of us. And I think that's just been one of the challenges of working in the digital and technological age. I don't know what you feel about it, but I do remember a story of surgeons complaining when now they're teaching surgery, and their students no longer have the dexterity that they once did, because now they're on their devices. They don't really require those kind of fine precision. So you might think that this is very artistic and not very tangible in terms of the skills that are being used. But when we lose those fine motor skills, we're actually losing our ability to do that fine work as we get older, and that might be demanded of us in our professional lives.
Oh.
Great. Entertaining your very patient audience. Thank you so much for returning. I hope everything works out better.
The joy of technology. Exactly when you don't want it to go crazy, it does.
Yeah.
So I've lost all those questions in the chat, so you might just have to email them to me.
No problem. I will.
So where was I? Right.